This is Mary Ann Sison and Doug Mansfield. We're at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, Jackson County campus. Today is February 16th, 2005, and we are interviewing Mrs. Janice Britton for the Veterans History Project. Okay, Mrs. Britton, why don't you tell us how you came to be involved with the military?
Well, after I graduated from college, I was considering going on to get my master's degree in nursing. I graduated from Vanderbilt University. But my father said, Janice, your country needs you. You're a nurse and you have a skill that your country needs. And unlike most situations, my father had been in World War I and he was a real patriot and he believed that. He said, you'll have an opportunity to travel and you'll meet people that you would not otherwise meet. And that's exactly what happened. So then I wanted to get in. I had a friend in the Air Force. But at that time, the Air Force was not taking any nurses. So I went into the Army and did basic training at Camp Rucker near Dothan, Alabama. And that was quite an experience when we learned how to pitch a tent and wear gas masks and drill and military courtesy and how to wear a uniform. And it was exciting. There was over 100 in our class. And somehow once I got in the service, I did enjoy it all.
Okay, tell us about your first assignment then.
Then after basic, we went to Camp Buckner in North Carolina near Durham. And we went by bus and train and so forth. And of course, they all had the tickets and there were a group of us going together. And Camp Buckner was a hospital that was enlarging. And the first patients, I had liked psychiatric nursing, so I had asked and was put on psychiatric nursing. They call it NP, neuropsychiatric nursing. And and again, that was a good experience. I learned to be the patient's advocate, and in several situations I felt I was able to make things better for them.
Mm-hmm. What kind of patients were you working with?
Well, these were people that now probably wouldn't be hospitalized, but the stress of battle, they were not psychotic, they were not schizophrenics or manic depressive. What's our new word for manic depressive?
Bipolar.
But they were not bipolar, but they were people that had given under stress. And so for that reason now they were limited to the wards they could go, but by the same token, they just needed to get control of themselves. And so I made friends with them, and I remember one of them that was telling me about his girlfriend at home, but he was getting a military discharge, but he was so ecstatic. He got flowers for me, and he did all kind of chocolates and so forth. And usually I had been trained that you didn't take tips from patients, but I felt for these psychiatric patients that I would do something to their confidence in themselves, and it was just a natural thing. So as it worked out, as I say, I enjoyed it, and I did feel that I was doing some good, and so we had a happy arrangement.
So these were guys with what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder?
That's right. That's,
okay.
yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
All right. So how long did you stay there?
Well, I wasn't there very long, actually. I got transferred, I'm not sure, maybe 3 or 4 months, and then I was transferred to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia to teach, because I did have a bachelor's degree, and I think that put me in line to be a teacher. And I was teaching surgical techniques to wax. And Fort Oglethorpe, of course, had been a cavalry post, and they had cleared out the stalls that were where horses stayed, concrete floor, and made classrooms out of them, because they had hundreds of wax here studying, and I would have classes of 50, and we would talk about I remember classes I had on sutures and needles and so forth for surgery. And that could be pretty dry and boring, so I really had to figure some stretch breaks and tell jokes and so forth to keep the students awake and keep the instructor awake too.
I know, I teach too. Okay.
But that was a spit and polish. I remember that officers' club so much, and there were a number of the officers there that wore jodhpurs, and it was really, it was an old time, very fine officers' club and the nice swimming pool. But again, we were just having fun. I do recall that because it was a training place, the military courtesy, we had to wear our signet, we had to salute, we had to abide by the military rule, as was proper at such a place, but we still had fun.
Okay, and from there, from your teaching assignment,
Yeah,
you moved on?
then, well, I wanted to get into the service and to the Air Force. I still had this Air Force in my mind. Actually, I should say, when I was in college, I took a course in flying, but my instructor, I was ready to solo, and my instructor got called in the military service, and I didn't get the solo, so I never got my wings. But that desire to fly had sort of been with me. So then, I asked, I made it known, I'm pretty vocal about things, I guess assertive, and I made it known that I wanted to get in the Air Force when there was an opening. So they told me to go see a colonel in Atlanta, see Oglethorpe wasn't too far from Atlanta. So I went in, I made an appointment, I think I spent a week in Atlanta, and I went to see the top lady. Well, I wasn't intimidated. I knew why I went, and she was extremely kind, and she said, do you want to, she said, I assigned some nurses to the Air Force last week. If I had known, I would have assigned you. She said, well, I'll have to do that again, and I'll see that your name is on the list. Do you know anybody else that wants to go? Well, I'm trying to think of the people I'd heard back that said they wanted to get in the Air Force, Air Force Army Air Corps. It was not the Air Force, let me correct that. It was Army Air Corps. And I couldn't think of anybody much, but at least I put the name in, and I felt good about seeing her. I went back to Fort Oglethorpe, and very soon I got orders to go to Drew Air Force Base to the Army Air Corps. So in my first year, in 1945, my first year in the service, I moved around, but I was moving in the direction I wanted to go, and that was my experience in the military. I let it be known what I wanted, and I got it.
Okay, great. Now, you're in the Army Air Corps. Tell us about it.
So then I do feel, I remember the sprawled out hospital and the fact that we had so many mosquitoes. You know, the old military hospitals, and I think maybe there's some around in Mississippi that are spread all out, and you had to go from ward to ward, and so that was exposure to the mosquitoes, and so we felt like we were giving transfusions to the mosquitoes all the time. But again, I can recall some patients I had there that had penicillin was just coming in. And this is a time, you see, when it was the miracle drug, and it was just a whole new thing in medicine. In fact, physicians gave it penicillin. But to see the results of a person who had temperature of 106 and see how they responded so quickly from one injection of penicillin was really miraculous. And I recall even patients realizing that they had been so near death and how awesome they felt about themselves. Gee, I'm alive and I almost died. And that wasn't on the battlefield. That was in the bed in Tampa, Florida. But nevertheless, the nearness to death was an awesome experience. So I did that for a while, and then the orders came for me to go to flight nurse school. That was the next thing that I wanted to do, and that was in Randolph Air Force Base, Texas, near San Antonio. So I got on the train and went to San Antonio. And that was in August of 45. See, I came in the service in March, and this was in August. And it was hot. I mean, it was hot. And we marched to classes, and we studied physiology and physiology of flight, and we went into the pressure chambers to see how it felt to be at 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, and then we had to learn about administering oxygen to patients and how we cared for them and the different kind of conditions that we might have, and particularly how patients with lung conditions or wounds and so forth and so on might. Because in those days, and this is extremely, this is the reason that was important, we did not have pressurized cabins. And so the planes flew certainly much lower than they do now, sometimes as low as 3,000 or 4,000 feet, but 5,000 feet was a pretty average cruising speed. But then there were times, and here in the United States, I remember going to the West Coast when we had to fly over the mountains, and if there was bad weather and it was icy, we had to fly higher, and so, you know, we did, and you just had to have that oxygen. And we always saw that the patients got it. Sometimes we were pretty exhausted after the flight because we didn't have time to take the oxygen ourselves, whereas the pilot and the other crew members could, you see, they could have their oxygen masks on, but you can't have your oxygen mask on and do too much care for many patients.
Did anyone ever
So in the training, we did learn those things. Then we went on trial, you know, we went on real flights in the central part of the states, and we had an instructor. And so we got to practice. Another aspect of that I should mention is watermanship and ditching. Now, they sound funny, and when I say ditching, I'm not talking about digging a ditch, but I'm talking about how you handle yourself in the water. And the first course we had was on being able to handle yourself in the water. Now, the lungs have the capacity to float if you can be relaxed, but if you're fighting and nervous, you will sink, and that was it. And I had always, I didn't ever take swimming lessons, but I always loved the water and could float, and so I didn't have any trouble with that. And of course, you do have Mae Wests and you do have inflatable things, but again, they may go wrong, and sometimes you can't get them going inflated until you can get yourself situated in the water. So those were, again, exciting, and as I say, I was young and everything for me was good. The other course that was particularly interesting in flight near school was on survival and how to survive in the desert or survive in the Arctic or wherever, and those were that was prepared for situations that I never had encountered. So, but nevertheless, I think we were all motivated to learn because there was the possibility that that could happen. So then after flight nurse school, I went back to Drew, and then I wanted to go overseas, and so I'll let that be known. War VJ's 1945. See, we had VE Day. Roosevelt died, I guess, and then we had VE Day, and so. Here everybody's joyous, and I am, but except I wanted to go overseas, and I didn't think that they would send people overseas with air evacuation. I was a flight nurse then and had my wings. After the war, well, that showed I didn't know what I was worried about, because I did get sent overseas, and we went back to Randolph Air Force Base to what they call staging, to prepare to go into the foreign field. And then we were sent by train to Los Angeles, and then north of Los Angeles, north of San Francisco, actually, we staged at Camp Stoneman, and from there we got on the ship and were going to the Philippines. I think there were 24 flight nurses and 5,000 troops. Well, I tell you, the naval officers decided that they would show us around, which we welcomed. We hadn't, I don't know that any of us had ever been on a ship before. And see, this was after the war, so I thought of it in a way as a cook's tour. We went on the U.S. Randall, but it was the first time they had not had troops. And on the ship, there were a number of people that were returned to civilians who were returned to the Philippines. So we got out, leaving the harbor. It was the time when that song "Harbor Lights" was popular, and I remember I got back at the back of the ship, the stern of the ship, into where I wasn't supposed to be. But nobody had found me, and I was enjoying myself. And then later on, I found out I was not where I was. But I watched the harbor lights fade, and I was enjoying that. And then I went down to the stateroom, and then it began getting rough. But so everybody kind of went to bed early. But then after that, we weren't in rough water, and I didn't get seasick. But the next morning, we had the news that we were going to have to stop in Hawaii. So we didn't go straight to the Philippines. But we were going to stop in Hawaii because we had to let soldiers aboard. And this is a typical military story because we got sail, and then they found we have people that are not going to the Philippines, so we have to let them. So we got in the harbor in the Philippines, and then they decided they had to pick up some cargo. So we had 2 days leave there. Well, we had a ball. A couple of the naval officers had decided, my friend and I were nice girls, and they were both married, but in the Navy they knew Hawaii, they knew places to go, and they had friends there. And they took us to their friend's home, and we just had a nicest time. Playing with their children, you know, and there was nothing like fearsome at all about this. We were just going on a new adventure. So we stayed there a couple of days, and Hilo Hattie was a person that tried to teach all people off the ship how to do the hula, you know, and you don't do it much with your show. They tell the story with the hands, and I have nice movies of those. So anyhow, after a couple of days in Hawaii, then we did sail on down. It was a nice sea, and we saw the Southern Cross Horizon Star, and then they said it was pretty going through the Philippine Islands, and we got up early in the morning to see the different islands, and then we landed in Manila. But Manila Harbor, in fact, we had to slow down to get there. Manila Harbor had been so bombed during the war that the harbor was not clear for many ships to get in. And we had to kind of wait our turn. But we got in, offloaded about 10 o'clock in the morning. And we got there, and would you know they didn't know we were coming? 32 flight nurses on flying status went to the Philippines, and they didn't have any facilities for women. So, of course, our chief nurse was very concerned, but I thought, so they had to make a place. And so we went to the BOQ. There weren't a lot of really very fancy bachelor's officers' quarters, but they did arrange some for but at first, wait a minute, we did have a detour. They found a guy a place that was not, I don't know whether they'd kept prisoners, I don't know who had stayed there, but we had a common shower, and it was really pretty rough the first times. I remember our solar heating system, because if we wanted a warm shower, you took it, you know, when the sun had heated the water. But, and we slept on cots and so forth and so on. But it had been, on the ship, we had been pretty tight quarters too, you know, and slept in bunk beds. But what were we going to do? So in the long run, a couple of things. There were still Japanese in the Philippine Islands that didn't know the war was over. And once they identified them, they would arrange for us to go and pick them up. Well, none of us spoke Japanese, and the places we had to land had almost been overgrown by the vines and the jungle. So I can remember on more than one occasion the pilot would fly a circle 3 or 4 times before he decided to come down and land. And we might pick up just 3 or 4 people. Well, these poor Japanese were scared to death, and they didn't know they were going home, and I always, it was such a shame I couldn't pat you on the back and say, you're going home. But, and sometimes we hit rough weather down in that tropics. You could hit thermals in the air, and we didn't have any really air evacuation. The planes were not equipped for air evacuation, so we just went along to accompany them. And but those were short flights, usually an hour or less. So we did that, and I think it was about 6 months before they finally decided that they'd have to find a place. Some of the nurses would go to the hospital that was at Clark Field, which was about, when we went to Clark Field first, see, we were first women going overseas. Mm-hmm. So I must say the men really didn't make over us, and they expected us to dance and to go to anything they had. But we flew up to Clark Field and spent the night, and they had a dance. But the nurses, they didn't need any nurses there. Well, finally, by a natural attrition, they did take, I think, about 6 of the nurses there. Then they made arrangements for some nurses to be stationed on Okinawa and Guam and other Pacific islands. But 20 of us went, or 15 of us went to Japan. Mm-hmm. And the vision was for us, and there was a General Ennis Whitehead, a 4-star general. I remember the first time I met him, I thought I didn't know how to, I didn't remember in military courtesy how you were supposed to act in the presence of a 4-star general, but I decided if I would try to be lady, that would be the best I could do. He had the vision of nurses being stationed to take care and move patients in peacetime. And so that is what it ended up after we got to Japan. Conchita Bobbitt was the person who was in charge of the group of us. We went to Tokyo. And Tokyo was really busy trying to come out from under the war. You know, it had been heavily bombed. But we stayed in a place that had been, we called it Army Hall. It had been quarters for the officers of the Japanese Army. And we had nice rooms and showers, and they had fixed it up so we had a nice dining room. There was a chapel there. I have a bulletin from the Easter service I went to in Meiji Chapel at Army Hall. And so here I was in this foreign land, unchristian nation, but I was in a American quarters that Americans had provided. But again, how are we going to fly? This is in Tokyo, and so then arrangements were finally made for us to go to a town named Tachikawa, and that's what I have a number of pictures of. And that was the headquarters. We actually worked in a hospital, but now this was 1946, and we moved patients from a hospital in Korea because the history is that Japan had occupied Korea and Manchuria, and after the occupation, after the Japanese surrendered, those countries were supposed to be guided back into their own way of life, but the whole structure of the land had been so destroyed that we were trying to help them, and there's a word for that doesn't come to mind, our official status in the land, but we weren't occupying the land. It wasn't, we were in the in Japan, we were in the Army of Occupation, but that was not true in Korea. But nevertheless, the Koreans did not understand why we were there, and we were really not very well welcomed. But there was a large Army hospital, and we moved patients from that hospital. They had to be driven over very country, muddy or dusty roads into Seoul. It was about a 2-hour ride on the bus for the patients to come, and we had to get a weather clearance in the morning to fly before we called, and we had terrible telephone, but we yelled and through many relays, we telephoned that we were going to fly, so the patients then were loaded into the ambulances or the big buses and gotten over the road and gotten to us. And then we flew them from Kimpo Air Base, which is near Seoul, Korea, into Tachikawa, Japan. And that was about a 2.5-hour flight. So the bus trip, the surface trip was almost as much as the time-wise as the flight, but they changed countries, and of course we're in an entirely different environment in the hospital where they had better medical care and beds with mattresses and qualified specialists and so forth to care for them. So that's what we did, and those flights were made according to the need, but at least every weekend it was enough for us to stay on flying status, but we also had a nice time at the hospital where we worked. It was about a 150-bed station hospital, and we cared for patients with appendicitis and sort of common ordinary illnesses. And we had an interesting group of medics, and we used to have a little martini club in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. And I think sometimes at that, after drink, maybe I could get more business done with the supply officer and with this or that, but that I could try to contact him with a lot of requisitions, you know, and do it the official way. But I have some nice memories. And Tachikawa is close enough to Mount Fujiyama that we could see the snow come down July and August of the months of the year for climbing the mountain, and I did climb the mountain while I was there. But the beauty of the land, because out in the countryside it hadn't been bombed, and you saw less of it. And Japanese are very neat, and of course it's a heavy populated land, and I always said they manicured it because you just didn't have any countryside like you drive, like I drove through today. But nevertheless, it was not messy, and people took care of their little places. And I remember the people in Japan, seeing them walk on those shoes that are like stilts, you know, the wooden sandals they wear, and with the kimonos and the obis and so forth. But in Korea, I don't remember studying about Korea. And the first trip I made Korea and saw these people with these stovepipe hats. And see, Korea had been isolated from the world in a way that Japan hadn't been. And they really and truly, it's interesting in the 50 years to realize how they have, you know, so much a part of the warp and woof of the world today, and they make so much computer equipment and the cars and things they make there now in South Korea. But it was certainly not that way. Then after I was overseas 2 years, and then we came back by ship back to San Francisco. And then I came back home for leave, and my friend and I, a friend Ellen Adams, had enjoyed each other so much. She was from North Dakota, and I was from Binghamton, Alabama. That's where my mother lived. My father was in Montgomery, Alabama. They were divorced. And so we were going to either be in Alabama or North Dakota. We wanted to be stationed together. Or we got to be stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And when she first saw the beautiful sand, she said that looked like snow. So then I was stationed at Eglin for a couple of years, for about a year and a half. And Eglin again was a station hospital, and one of the interesting things that nurses do in a place like that is most of us were single and dating, and so we'd work 12 hours night shift. And then we had a day shift and an evening shift, and which would be, sometimes we'd have a split day. We'd work in the morning from 7 till 10, and then the afternoon from 3:30 to 7. So we'd have more free evenings. And there's nothing spectacular about that assignment, but somehow I still wanted to be in flight nursing, and I asked to be transferred to the School of Aviation Medicine, where I had learned flight nursing, and I got that assignment. So I went back to Randolph Air Force Base, Texas. And I was there, and when the Korean War, when the North Koreans invaded the South Koreans, at least I knew where Korea was, and in truth, a lot of people did not know where Korea was. And I thought, I'm very secure because they'll need a lot more flight nurses and technicians. I was helping train aeromedical technicians. But I was wrong, because his friend and I had planned to go to, we had orders. We were going from Brooklyn to Mexico City for leave. And instead, we went to Korea. And they needed us in Korea. They really did. We had not been prepared. You know, there's a lot of discussion, and people call it the Truman's War, that we didn't know what we were doing when we had underestimated the North Koreans and the whole situation. So we got ourselves into something that we weren't prepared for. But as Rumsfeld says, now you do when you go to war with what you got. But because the group that I had been with had really been deactivated almost after we were there, and they were mainly in the Philippines. So as soon as the Korean crisis came, and we did call it the crisis, they sent the squadron and the few nurses that were with it back to Tachikawa. But they also needed other people, and so when I got back to Japan, then I was immediately assigned to a southern island of Japan, and I've got a map there that kind of shows clearly, to Ashia, which was just 1 hour from the southern tip of Korea. And so that was the quickest way to get, because actually the fighting, that was the tip of the peninsula where the fighting was, and where we almost got pushed off the peninsula. So that made it a busy place. And so I was stationed down there.
What did you do there?
Well, we flew sort of night and day. I kind of described we'd have a 5 o'clock wake up, and then we'd have breakfast, and then we'd go down to the line, be at the line at 6 o'clock for 7 o'clock takeoff. But we could fly. There were a lot of planes going to Korea taking supplies. This is when that cargo, when General Turner said, and 50 years ago, Time magazine featured him on the cover. He had been with the Cold War and the Berlin airlift, and we can fly anything, anywhere, anytime. And so that meant that they could get the ammunition, the gas, the food supplies, the clothing, whatever the troops needed, we could get them there by air. So that means the planes, the Navy and so forth had a different role. So we were a part of that combat cargo. There were a lot of planes going over, but there were not many planes that were equipped specially for air evacuation. Well, General Turner got there to Japan about the time I did. And by the time they got things organized, then he appointed General Alan Smith to be head of the Medical Air Evacuation Squadron. And those two things got things going for the system to evacuate patients by air. Because formerly, even in Korea, where there weren't very much rail, the Army had claimed a lot of that transporting patients. So history books do show that there was some battle between the Army and the Air Force and the Air Corps for the evacuation of patients. But and again, one of the articles later, before I left in this second tour, the president of the American Medical Society came, and the death rate was reduced so greatly from World War II to Korea by the more people were evacuated by air. And the quicker you get a wounded person, and MASH was a part of that. Now, we evacuated patients from MASH. And sometimes the helicopters would bring the patients into the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and they would just be treated briefly, and then they would be put on our planes. So there was a lot of variance in the kind of plane in the early days. Because I was there this time, I went over in September of 1950. And this second time, I was there only 10 months. I was there until June of 51. But that was the early days and when things were being set up, because and caring for the loads of wounded people were quite different than the loads we had had before of the sick people from the hospital. So a nurse was assigned to a technician, and I can't praise that technician too highly because they helped with all kinds of things in lifting. I guess it would be appropriate for me to talk a bit about what you do as a flight nurse. Is when patients are brought aboard, number one, they don't have a real medical record, but they have a sheet. And we usually had like we call it a manifest with the list of the people that were going to be evacuated and what was their diagnosis, and maybe something they needed oxygen or they were getting intravenous or they had a cast on or some of that sort of thing. And so then we tried to position them in the plane so we could care for them. The patients with casts, if they had a heavy leg cast, we'd put them on the floor, and then other patients, or if they had something wrong with the right side, we'd put them on the left, and we tried to arrange them. So the plane then, after it had taken its cargo, had been taken out, the plane had straps to fasten the stretchers, or they had bucket seats so that you could get the patients. And we had a number of ambulatory patients. Sometimes psychiatric patients would be accommodated as ambulatory patients. And on occasion we had a person who was just afraid to fly, and so if we gave them a sedative, we could help them relax. And although it wasn't a long flight, you know, if you're in pain and if you're grasping for air, 2.5 hours can be a long flight. So we had, we were flying in the early days, because the airstrips in Korea were so poor, the larger planes couldn't land. So we were flying in planes, in C-46s and C-47s. And anytime you want me to stop this, I can. So those patients, we carried 20 or 25 patients. But then when we could have the heavier C-54, that was a 4-engine plane that could carry 28, I believe was the specified number. But when we were almost surrounded by the Chinese in the incident that they called the Chosin Reservoir, we took anybody we could get in the plane. So we've had patients strapped down to the aisle, in the aisle where the aisle had been. And there were occasions then when we flight nurses and aeromedical technicians flew separate from each other, because we were trying to get as many people out as we could. And of course we did. And for that special work, we've got special presidential citation and some medals. Then as things got a bit more organized and we pushed them back, and we retook Kimpo, which the North Koreans had taken, and then we went north of the 38th parallel, and one of the headlines in one of the Air Force papers there, I was the first nurse to fly across the 38th parallel. And it only happened, that was my assignment. It wasn't that I did anything any different than any other nurse. It just happened that it was my day to fly, and they decided for us to fly and we knew that the Marines had secured the place. And there were no patients to be picked up that day, but then later there were many patients to be picked up. But by this time there were some station hospitals in Korea. So then we might move them from the front fighting area to the station hospital. And some of them were returned to duty. And particularly at the time of the Chosin Reservoir, there were some times when the fighting was so intense. And as you recall, MacArthur's headquarters, and they had not figured the Chinese were as massive as they were, and that they were coming in, and we were unprepared for there, although they had been secretly coming into the country. And there's a lot of discussion in military history about who knew and who didn't know and who made errors and so forth. But the truth was that our attempt was to get as far as we could possibly safely go and pick up patients to bring them back to a safer area. And that's why I always thought I had such a good job, because I was taking wounded people from a bad situation to a better situation, and I never saw my job as being one that was hazardous. I saw it as being one that was needed and that we were doing a good job. And I remember one time things were getting organized, and I'd flown over, but there were two of us flew over together, but one flew with the patients that were waiting, and there were more patients than there were planes to take them back to Japan. So we were waiting. And I said to the guys, "When did y'all last eat?" Well, they hadn't eaten in a long while. So I thought, I got to do something about this. So I said, well, some of them were ambulatory and some of them were on stretcher, just out there on the ground, landing field. So we walked up to the mess hall and we walked in. And number one, everybody looked, because women, it's kind of it's a no man's land. And so I said, is the mess officer here? So the mess sergeant said, no, but can I help you? And I said, well, I've got some hungry patients over here. I wondered if you could feed them. Oh, they were happy to feed them, but they didn't have any mess kits. They didn't have any extra mess kits. Well, these patients didn't have any mess kits either. So one of them, I heard somebody say, well, I've got an extra mess kit. And I said, well, they decided to get some food together and we'd just see. And they found enough containers to take food to them, and they had thermoses. We had some thermos bottles of water and coffee, but we got fresh coffee and fresh water. And they used celery, and one of them used his toothbrush holder to scoop his food up, you know. Mm-hmm. They were hungry enough. And I've forgotten what we had, but it was not very often. And I said, I sure am glad that this wasn't a steak dinner, because we didn't have any knives to cut it. And one of the guys piped up and he said, ma'am, this is better than a steak dinner because I was so hungry. So that's a nice kind of a memory. And then eventually the plane did come and we did get them back safely. I never did lose a patient in flight. I had some very critically ill patients and some that I was very happy when we landed. And I would like to say that the pilots were always very accommodating and trying. They were always interested in what they could do to make the flight comfortable, and they always tried to make it safe, as smooth a landing as they could, and to fly as low as they could. And so it was a team effort. And when we were in difficulty, I never figured that the cockpit was mine. The cabin was mine, but not the cockpit. And so I didn't worry about what went over there. And there were times when we had emergency landing, and one of the pilots, I guess this was in my first tour of duty, if I can jump back to that, where we were making an emergency landing. And they had taught us in flight nursing school not to get excited, to act as normal as we could. So I was putting on my cap and putting on my lipstick and trying, we were going to land. And the pilot said he looked back to see what was going on, and he said, there, my maiden name was Feagin. He said, I was scared to death. See, he had been in World War II, and he was still there and had not rotated back to the States, and he was war weary, and I was scared to death. We were landing on one engine. I looked back, and Feagin was putting on her lipstick. And he just couldn't quite get over that. But then I didn't have any of that kind of experience in my second tour, and it did seem to go quickly because we were very busy. And in between, we did get some R&R, and I had some trips to go to places in Japan, and it was a pretty country, and they had rebuilt a lot, and so but then, as I mentioned, the president of the American Medical Association was out. They came on this inspection tour, and it happened that they were on my flight. Some of the important bigwigs were on my flight. And I was so impressed. They talked with the patients and got the patient's story. And of course the patients, we were psychologically, an airplane taking you away was a psychological thing. People could be depressed and feel a lot better when somebody came. And so they was, again, that impressed them about what we were doing in terms of not only for the mental health as physical health. Well, along with that inspection crew was a person who was then the commander of the School of Aviation Medicine, which had moved from Randolph Air Force Base to Gunter in Montgomery, Alabama, my hometown, my birthplace. And did I want to go back to Gunter? Well, yes, I did. And the theory was that I had battle experience and I could go and teach, which was plausible to me, because the routine duty of tour of duty, you see, was 2 years. So I came home in 10 months. Well, again, I was very happy to come back. As I said, it completed my time. And I enjoyed teaching at Gunter. And when you go to Gunter now, there's not even a flight line up there. It's an adjunct to Maxwell. But we were part of the school of, we were part of Air University back then. And somewhere in my career, I did have some courses with Air University in which we had college professors teach. I never did get any college credit for that, but they were good experiences, such as courses in map reading, in weather and meteorology. I remember, and those courses are lifetime courses, you know. So I came out of the Air Force after 8 years. I met my future husband at Maxwell Staff and Command School, and we were married at Gunter Air Force Base Chapel in a real wedding. And I was in the service for 8 years, and I asked to be discharged, and I was.
What a great story. Would you explain some of your photographs for us? I'll get it for you. I'll get it. You're wired. I'll get it for you. You sit down. You can't go too far.
Okay.
You're hooked up. Let's see. Tell us about this picture. You can stand up if you want. Yeah, you can stand up.
That's you on the aircraft.
Yeah.
This is a picture, this is my flight nurse kit that had bandages and syringes and morphine syrettes and the medications and so forth that I needed. This is the oxygen tank, because we were flying in unpressurized cabin and we had to get oxygen from this tank that we administered through masks. And this is a blanket. We had a bag of blankets. And this, and I didn't mention it, we used funny books and magazines, and I had a friend who sent those to me during the Korean War, and they were like $5 bills to give them to the troops because they were so hungry, and they're icons of the USA. And so that was my bag of magazines. And as you see, we didn't have any, we had to climb up. Now, when patients were brought aboard, they lifted them up. Also, if there was an ambulatory patient, sometimes they had to climb up those. But usually they had a ramp. Okay. And I can show you a ramp if you want to see it.
Okay. Let's stop that. Let's get another.
The hat I bought in China when I was on leave. I got a leave, in fact, on Thanksgiving Day 1947, I flew from Okinawa to Shanghai because I knew there were Army nurses I could stay with, and I was there. And when I spent a month in China, and I bought that hat, and it is nice and warm and has its insignia in Chinese inside. And when I came home in 1948, Golden Gate in 48, I didn't need that hat, and I didn't know what to do with it. But when I went back to Korea in 1950, and wintertime was coming, I said, "Mother, send me my hat." And she did. And everybody was envious of my hat.
But we were fighting the Chinese then.
And then, see, we didn't know who we were fighting at first. And one of these, I think, that might go with the story. I believe we were flying in a C-54, and I'm not sure quite where we're going, but you see we have a lot of stretcher patients, and the stretchers are tied down to the floor here, and they are really quite secure in they're in brackets along the wall. And when we had to, there were times when we put litters in here. But I'm sitting on a blanket. We always carried extra blankets, and I believe that's what I'm sitting on. And this is the cabin of the plane. The background there is the cabin of the plane. And people enjoyed. Because if they'd been fighting, they hadn't seen any kind of news for a long while. And even prisoners of war enjoyed me. They would look at them upside down.
Okay.
This is the way that we got patients on and off the plane with this kind of ramp. And the C-54, of course, is high enough that you need some help, and very soon they got the automatic lifters, but we had a lot of patients that were moved on and off the plane by this truck and the extra ramp they had.
Okay.
As you see, these people have blankets around them. These are Chinese prisoners of war. And I must say that that was a humane thing to do. Although we didn't have a lot of extra airspace, we did evacuate and try to do the best we could in caring for prisoners of war, even though our doctors were pretty busy caring for our own people. But the stories were that at night, they would count the prisoners that they had, and in the morning there would be more prisoners than were at night, because if they felt defeated, being a prisoner of the USA was better than being a prisoner of the Russians or the North Koreans. So
they actually came to you guys.
Yeah.
Is this it?
Yeah, that's the one I'm saying.
Okay, you want to put this one?
Yeah. And it's interesting how you communicate, although you don't say the language, somehow you can usually do things that show your compassion. And here I am with some, and these prisoners are on stretchers. They didn't always have stretchers, but you see the one here with the head wound. And we did try to keep them from pain, and I remember on occasion there were maggots in some of their wounds because they hadn't been dressed, so you did what you could to take care of them, and they were evacuated. Then they would be evacuated from northern Korea to further south to an area where they were detained. I don't believe to my knowledge, any of the Korean prisoners ever came to Japan. Okay, as I said, the 801st Medical Air Evac Squadron first originated in crisis in the South Pacific, and at that time, Walt Disney, from the Disney Studios in California, designed this logo. And so the 801st claimed it, and we have an 801st group now that meet together every few years, and we use this Walt Disney logo. I guess.
Okay, tape's rolling, I'll hold it down. Try to get that out of there. Okay, I got it. Go ahead, I got it.
Okay, you want to tell us about it?
I got it, you can talk
Ms.
about it.
Britton, go ahead, you can talk now.
Okay, I was really flattered with this Air University sheet that said First Nurse across the 38th parallel. Again, that was my duty to do. It just happened that I was assigned to go, and I remember we weren't sure whether it was in our hands but we felt that the Marines had, we knew the Marines had secured it at the airfield, but we didn't see any smoke of battle, and so we landed, but there were not many patients that day to be picked up.
Okay.
And flying north of the 38th parallel was no different than flying south of the 38th parallel. You looked down and everything looked really the same. Out of waiting for troops. And while we did, we decided that we would eat. And it was cold weather, and there was some coals from a fire, and so we were able to heat our sea rations. And when we opened them, we had sausage, and one of the persons in the group, as it turned out, we were sitting around there eating, was from Mississippi. And he said he sure did wish it was hog killing time. We got to talking about cold weather, and when in the old days they made sausage and cured hams, or started to cure hams. When the cold weather came, they killed the pigs to make the sausage. And so, because we were in cold weather and a Mississippian and I were talking, we remembered the days of hog killing back in Mississippi in our youth.